we're going to talk about sin and the temptation that sin has, and how sin is sometimes pretty sneaky. Oftentimes, we'll probably say, sin is pretty sneaky. And there are areas in our lives that we have to be careful of. Now, as we mature and grow and develop, sometimes I think we have this mentality that we kind of outgrow sin. That, oh, well, sin's no longer a big deal for me anymore. While we believe in the transforming power of Jesus Christ, we believe that Jesus can give us victory over sin, but I promise you, you don't outgrow sin. Satan never says, no, that person's too good. I'm not going to go challenge them. That's not how it works. But a lot of times, I think what happens is we become a follower of Jesus for so long that we're supposed to have it all figured out by this point, and so we try to hide. And maybe hide is too strong a word. Maybe it's not strong enough. But we live a life that maybe could be considered sneaky. We try to do things where other people don't necessarily notice it. And we do this in other areas of life. We do this with snacks a lot of times, right? I love the concept of a sneaky snacker, right? You only want to take so much that nobody notices that there's any gone, but you also want to make it so nobody knows that you took it in the first place. Nobody catches you in the scene of the crime, I guess. And we do this for various reasons. You know, Easter wasn't that long ago, and I have no shame in this. I've eaten some of my kids' Easter candy. No shame with that. And when I take a piece of their candy, it's not one of those things where I'm hiding it to avoid consequences from them, but there are consequences, because if they see me, they're going to throw a fit about it, right? Now, if they see me, I'm going to say that is what it is, right? But the reality is we try to hide our sin. But yet, at the same time, we know that's not possible. Psalm 69:5 says, God, you know how foolish I am. My sins cannot be hidden from you. Right? We know that. We know we can't hide from God, yet that's what we do. And we see there's some scripture where this happens. Adam and Eve in the garden, when they sinned, they hid from God. That's how we respond. But as I think about hiding, one of the things that comes to mind is that when you talk about relationships and how relationships can be healthy, the healthiest relationships are those when both people can live transparently. If you can be yourself completely with the other person, that is the healthiest that's the healthiest way you can have a relationship. Now, that doesn't mean rude, belligerent, all those things are acceptable. That's not my point. But if you don't have to hide yourself, if you can be fully open with the other person, that is when your relationship can be most healthy. And so when we know that God knows our sins, that should transform how we respond to Him. That should change that, God knows me. I can be myself with God, not as though He excuses sin, not as though He says sin is no big deal, but that you can be yourself. But again, sin is a big deal, and there are different traps that we can fall into with sin. Sometimes we try to be sneaky about it, but we also have times where we have certain temptations that are real difficult. And so I brought some examples today that I hope will illustrate this. So I have different things in my life that I know that are real difficult for me to avoid. And one of them are these donuts. And the thing about these donuts, and I mean, I'll eat the white powder ones. I'll eat the cinnamon ones, chocolate ones. I mean, if you know me, you know I love chocolate, right? But the best ones are the chocolate outside and then the chocolate on the inside. Those are fantastic. But the thing about these donuts is they're not any good. And I know that. But if I have these donuts, I can't stop eating them. And another problem, and this is a marketing scheme, I think, you go to the gas station and you can buy the sleeve that's like 5 or 6 of them, and you get for $1.50, or then you can get this thing, which is like 4 times as much, for $2.50. Now, it makes no economical sense in my mind to get the $1.50 one, and so now I've got all these extra donuts that I can't stop eating. So if I go on a road trip, I've got to get a whole bag for myself because nobody else is going to get any, because I just can't stop eating these things for some reason. And it's kind of like Pringles, I guess. Once you pop, you can't stop. But the thing that's so frustrating is they're not good. But one of the reasons that I know, well, one more is not going to hurt. Each donut's like 70 calories. So, you'll have one more. That's not going to be that big of a deal, right? We have things like that where we can't stop. But Proverbs chapter 27, verse 20 says, just as death and destruction are never satisfied, human desire is never satisfied. So when we're talking about sin, we're never going to get to a point where we're satisfied. We're never going to get to a point where we say, you know what? That's good. I'm topped off. That's all I need for right now. Sin always wants more. It's always demanding more, always seeking more. But there are times where we have temptations in our life that we just can't resist. We can't stop getting it. But we also have things, I said they're not any good. I think they're good. I wouldn't buy them if I didn't think they were good, but I know the quality of the actual food is not really that great compared to other things that I could get. But I think there are sometimes we eat things, or at least I do, maybe you don't. We eat things that you eat it and you know it's still not any good. And one of the things that I don't even know why we keep them is leftover French fries. So I've got some French fries right here, and, we'll put them in the fridge. We'll have them in the box, and, the next day or so, I'll want some type of snack, and I'll open the fridge, and I'll see these French fries. And I'll look at them, and I'll be like, man, I know French fries left over are not good. And it's not going to be satisfying. It's not going to taste good. But yet I reach for one and I eat it anyway. And as I'm eating it, I'm thinking, why am I doing this? Because it's not any good. And I finished the French fry and I said, that was not satisfying at all. And I knew this ahead of time. I knew that was going to be the result. And yet I did it anyway, which brings me to Romans 7:19. I want to do what is good, but I don't. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway. Now, I'm not trying to say that we are slaves to sin, and we're going to get to that in a minute, but to recognize that that's the temptation that sin does. There are times where we say we know it's wrong, we know it's not going to be satisfying, but yet we're drawn to it. It's like a moth to a flame. We can't get away from it. It just seems like it has all this power over us. Because there's a difference between knowing something in your heart or knowing something in your head and knowing something in your heart, or in the case of French fries, your stomach. Right? There's a difference between that. I can know it's wrong, but until my heart is changed, until my heart is different, it's going to be really difficult, if not impossible, for me to resist. But there are times where I think we have a commitment issue, or maybe we try to justify our actions. And when I say commitment level, it's real hard to want to say we want to give everything to Jesus. We can say that. It's real hard to actually do that. And so a lot of times we go through life living what I would refer to as a generic faith. And now I buy generic a lot of times, but I've got some ranch dressing here that is generic ranch dressing. And the thing about generic, and these donuts are generic, I guess, as well. The thing about generic is it's cheaper. It doesn't cost as much. And there are certain things with generic that it's the same. Like, there's no big deal. I would say I'm not much of a ranch eater, so to me, I don't care what kind of brand the ranch is. But I'm telling you what, these don't compare to the name brand. The name brand are so much better. And actually, the generic don't come with the chocolate on the inside, so that's a big negative for them as well. But the fact of the matter is generic is a cheap knockoff of the actual brand. But I'm reminded of Moses when it talks about in Hebrews chapter 25. Moses left his people, left Egypt, and went to live with the Midianites. But God called him back, and it says he chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. And then John chapter 1, verse 14, we find that the Word, that is Jesus, became human and made his home among us. Moses and Jesus didn't live a cheap, non-committal life. They lived a full-fledged, fully authentic life. Now, Moses made mistakes. I'm not trying to say Moses is Jesus. But the reality is, we try to live a generic life. And what I mean by that is we want to get all the benefits of Jesus without it costing us very much. We don't want it to cost us anything. We want all the benefits, but we don't want to change. We want all the benefits, but we don't want to have to sacrifice or give other things up. And so what we're left with is cheap grace. You know, we're gonna kind of live for Jesus. We're gonna sort of live for Jesus. We want all the benefits, but we don't want it to cost us anything. But sometimes we have deception that we have to deal with, and I think some of you have heard me say this before. I think the dirtiest culinary trick are oatmeal raisin cookies. I think, like you see a cookie. Some of you like, I see somebody like oatmeal. I've never met anybody who got to the counter and saw a chocolate chip cookie and say, "Oh." No, nobody's disappointed by a chocolate chip cookie. But when you see an oatmeal raisin cookie, here's my thought process through it. So I see the cookie off in the distance. You know, it's a beautiful sunny day outside. The wind is blowing in my hair, right? But I see the cookie, and say, "Oh, a cookie." And I get a little closer and I say, "Oh, it's oatmeal." Yeah, not a big deal. You know, you're trying to be healthy, but let's be real. It's still a cookie, right? It's not healthy. But that's okay. Not a big deal. And I get there, and you know, sometimes the problem with oatmeal raisin cookies is you don't know it's raisin until you eat the cookie. And you start chewing the cookie, and you're like, "Well, that's not a chocolate chip." That's really disappointing. And so maybe you like oatmeal raisin cookies, by all means. Don't give me any. But I think it's deceptive. And obviously I'm joking a little bit. Now, if I had to, I could eat an oatmeal raisin cookie, right? That's not that big a deal, but it's not something I like. But Hebrews chapter 3, verse 13 says, "You must warn each other every day while it is still today, so that none of you will be deceived by sin and hardened against God." And what I'm getting at with the oatmeal raisin cookie is it tries to look like a chocolate chip cookie, but it's not. It tries to look like something else, but it's not. So if you like oatmeal raisin cookies, substitute something else for that perspective. But there are times where we as followers of Jesus try to look like a follower of Jesus, but we're not. So from a distance, people can say, "Oh, that person looks like they're following Jesus." But the closer they get, the more they say, "There's something wrong about this picture. There's something that's inauthentic about what is happening." See, there are people who have been turned off to Jesus because of their interactions with those who claim to follow Jesus. And I'm not trying to just be degrading to us or be overly anxious about it, but to recognize that we have to be careful about who we are, about the life we have committed to live, about what Jesus has called us to. Because another trap we fall into is that we try to cover things. You can think about your food, that we add a lot of what I've referred to as unhealthy coverings. It's probably the most prominent two are salt and butter. Now, we add salt and butter to everything. But you know, you make a nice dish of broccoli, and then you smother it with cheese, right? Or you get a celery stick and you say, "You know what? We're going to dip that in ranch dressing." And so we have these nice healthy items that we tend to then cover with unhealthy things. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you do that, I'm not trying to say it's wrong. But what I'm getting at is how we try to do that with our faith. We got this nice thing in Jesus, but you know, it's hard. It's hard to swallow. It's hard to follow him. So we're going to cover it with some things that aren't Jesus to make it easier, to make it better. Because you can think of that celery stick. I mean, you're eating a stick, right? A stalk. That's what you're eating. It's not good. I don't know anybody. Chris, do you eat celery just plain? Okay. So somebody in the back did. But a couple people. I don't know how you do it. So you're eating a stick, but I recognize the analogy breaks down a little bit that Jesus isn't lame like a celery stick. That's not my point. But to recognize that we try to add things that are non-Jesus to Jesus so we feel our life is better. But Jesus tells us we can't live that way. And in Luke chapter 9, people are coming to Jesus about following him. And this one person says in verse 61, Lord, I will follow you, but first let me go say goodbye to my family. And Jesus responds by saying, anyone who puts a hand to the plow and then looks back is not fit for the kingdom of God. If we want to follow Jesus, we got to remove everything else from our life. We got to get rid of everything. And he's specifically talking about his family. And Jesus says, you got to follow me, and you cannot worship your family. You got to follow me first. Now, we all have preferences. We all have passions and gifts and things that we would like things to work out this way or that. But what I'm getting is you can't just add Jesus to your life and say, well, that's good. Now, Jesus is good. I mean, I hope we affirm that and we recognize that. But we can't just squeeze Jesus into our life. Nancy Corns has shared this story a few times. Now, her and Charlie came to know Jesus when they were almost 60 years old. And one of the things that they did before Jesus is they'd go to flea markets and they'd sell and they'd have a good time. They'd make some money, made some good friends, I'm sure, with that. Well, when they came to know Jesus, they recognized flea markets are on Saturday and Sunday. And so they tried to figure out, well, how are we going to do this? How are we going to get this all together so we can have both Jesus and our old life at the same time? And eventually Nancy said they came to the conclusion, well, we just have to give up the flea markets. If we want Jesus, we can't have the flea markets too. Now, if you go to a flea market, that's fine. That's not my point. But they recognized that they couldn't have both. But I think a lot of times we don't recognize that. And the longer we've been a follower of Jesus, the harder it is to have self-awareness of what's happening in our lives, of what's trying to creep in. What are we trying to add to Jesus? Because there's a difference between God and good. And we have to make sure we recognize that. But we also come back to the generic of the bare minimum is not what we're called to do. If our motive in life is saying, what is the bare minimum I can do in following Jesus and still get into heaven? I'm not sure I'm pretty confident you're not respecting Jesus with that mentality. Right? So we can't just add coverings to it. But we also have times where we have things that are good, or we try to combine things, or we can think about, we do this and we'll add this to Jesus and we'll make it about Jesus and it'll be good. But sometimes I think we do that just more out of convenience. Now, one of my favorite times of year is Christmas. I love Christmas. I could listen to Christmas music all year round, but there's one thing that I just can't stand about Christmas, and it's the fact that people, for whatever reason, think that you need to ruin a nice piece of chocolate by adding mint to it. It just ruins the chocolate, right? Now, let me pause for a moment. I'm not a very picky person. I'm sharing some of my idiosyncrasies with my food preferences today. But I just think, why ruin a nice piece of chocolate by adding mint to it? And so you get that box of chocolate and you open it up and you look at it and all of a sudden you get that mint smell and you're like, well, that's no good anymore. But now there are other people in my family that enjoy mint, and that's fine, and I support them, and hopefully they get counseling. But I think what we do sometimes, and there's nothing wrong with mint. People like mint, and mint is good. People like chocolate, and chocolate is good. But when you put the two together, to me, it's not any good. And so what we try to do, we have something in our life, well, this is good, and then we have Jesus over here, and we try to combine them, and that's not always how it works. Now, I'm not saying Jesus says that we got to no longer follow our passions or anything of that nature. But in Luke chapter 14, verse 33, he says, so you cannot become my disciple without giving up everything you own. So this is a very similar concept to the adding Jesus, to adding the unhealthy coverings to your healthy food. We're trying to add, we're trying to combine. But one of the things is that no matter how much mint you put in there, even if you just put a little bit of mint, the whole chocolate is consumed by that mint. You can taste it throughout. So it's not a matter of the amount. It's a matter of you're allowing something that's non-Jesus into your life. That you're allowing some non-chocolate into it, and it's no longer has the spiritual integrity. So we must give up everything for Jesus. But we have these temptations, these things that try to creep into our lives. Now again, the bare minimum is we can't We can't stop there. We can't say, what is the minimum I need to do in order to get into heaven? It's the difference between things that are good and things that are God, and we have to make sure we don't allow those lines to be blurred. But the good news is that Jesus provides a way for us to be transformed. He provides a way for us to be able to overcome all of these things that would try to hinder us, all these things that would try to pull us down, all these things that will try to get us away from Him. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 5, it says, "So put to death the sinful earthly things lurking within you." Now remember, I started this by talking about the fact of we never outgrow sin. You never get to a point where sin is not a problem, where sin is something you don't have to think about. You never arrive at that point. So no matter how long you've been a follower of Jesus, we have to recognize sin is something we have to constantly deal with, something we have to say, we can't just let our guard down on it, because when we forget about it, when we start coasting, that's when we start to drift. That's when we start to drift away from Jesus and find other ways. But see, Jesus is calling us to something better. He's calling us not to succumb to things that we don't want to do, but we do anyway. He's saying, put to death those things. See, death is not our master. Sin is not our master. We are not obligated to sin. And through Jesus, it is possible to have a new life. Through Jesus, the sin in your life can be destroyed. That doesn't mean we ignore it. That doesn't mean we're indifferent to it, but it can be destroyed. It doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it's going to be all wonderful. But Jesus gives us a new way to live. And one of the things we have to be careful about is this includes our mind as well. It includes our thought processes, our attitudes. Now, you have thoughts come in your mind about other people that are not always super Jesus, right? And the most obvious one, at least for me, is when you get caught behind somebody going slow in traffic, right? I don't have very warm and fuzzy thoughts for that person. We have those in various areas of our life where we don't have warm and fuzzy thoughts that honor Jesus with that person. But Romans chapter 12, verse 2 says, "Do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will." Your mind can be transformed in Jesus. You don't have to go through life with the mentality of sin, because Jesus can transform you. And so I put down here in my notes, being different is okay. We don't like to be different. We like to fit in. Now, there may be certain areas where we like to artistically display our personality or have something stick out in a way that we're really proud of. But for the most part, we like to fit in. We like people to accept us. And if we come back to the point of the healthiest, strongest relationships are when you can be most transparent with the other person. It's okay for us to be different, because this is what Jesus is calling us. He's calling us not to be accepted by the world. He's calling us to a new way of life that's better. That the life the world is calling us to is full of lies, is untruth, it's unhopeful. But if we look at our world, there's a problem if a Christian and a non-Christian look the same. And by that I mean there's no obvious mark or whatnot. But if you're a follower of Jesus and people can't tell that you're a follower of Jesus, that's a problem. People have to be able to tell that you're a follower of Jesus. Otherwise, Jesus is not actually making a difference in your life. But I think we have this problem, this fear of missing out. And I find it interesting, as my boys get older, I have that fear for them. I don't want them to miss out. Now, I don't want to miss out too. I'm getting mine on that as well. But to recognize that we have that fear. We don't want to miss out, so we want to look normal. We want to look the part. We want to be accepted. And we can sit here today, we can talk about how, if we really follow Jesus, then we're not actually missing out on anything. But it's a lot easier to say that than it is to actually do it. But when you think about this new life that Jesus is calling us to, that we can put to death the things of this world, that our minds can be transformed, what we're longing for is for Jesus to fill us, for Jesus to consume us, for Jesus to satisfy us. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 23 and 24, speak to that promise. It says, may the God himself, the God of peace, sanctify you through and through. May your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. The one who calls you is faithful, and he will do it. If you are familiar with the Church of the Nazarene, you may have heard the term entire sanctification or holiness or those types of lines. And 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 is where we get that, sanctify you through and through, entirely sanctify. But what we're asking for is for Jesus to come and to cleanse us completely. When we first come to know Jesus, we can be saved, and he provides a covering for us. But then we can get deeper into our faith where Jesus cleanses us, not just covers us, and so we just wait for him to come. He cleanses us so we can live in the reality that he's calling us to live now, so that we can put to death the things of this world, so that sin no longer has to be our master. But here's the thing about Jesus, that if you pray for more of Jesus humbly, he's going to do it. See, there's the promise embedded in here. The one who calls you is faithful, and he will do it. This is not some, well, if you pray, maybe God will do it. If you come to him, he might get around to doing it. He is faithful, and he will do it. If you go to Jesus seeking more of him, he is going to give you more of him. But what has to happen is you've got to get yourself out of the way. You've got to put to death the things of this world. You've got to get them out of the way so that Jesus can come in. See, God doesn't want sin to have power in your life. He doesn't want you to be succumbing to these things that you just can't stop, that aren't good for you, that aren't good, that aren't satisfying. But yet we have come to this mentality that we don't have to deal with sin because I've arrived spiritually. I have grown. I have figured it out. And maybe we don't think we've figured it out, but I do think we have this mentality that we've got to look the part before we can join the club. That you know, it's Sunday and we put on our Sunday best, right? And maybe it's not your actual best, but you look nice. For the most part, we look nicer on Sundays than we do throughout the rest of the week. Right? That's common. That's typical. And so we want people to look the part. And so the last thing I have here is not a food item. It's a thing of floss. All right? And it's in its package, so you don't have to be grossed out about any hygiene stuff. But I had a dentist appointment a week and a half ago. No cavities. Woo. But and I had no concern before the appointment. My teeth weren't hurting. I was fine. And my appointment was at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So I went throughout my day. I had lunch, and after lunch, I brushed my teeth, and then I flossed. Now, I floss almost every single night, so I'm pretty diligent in that regards. But I always find it really interesting that we brush our teeth and floss and do all those things before we go to the dentist. That we want to put our best foot forward so the dentist thinks that we're actually better than we are. Before I used to floss every night, I would still floss before I went to the dentist. And I think some people have that same mentality with Jesus, that I've got to get it all figured out before I come to Jesus. I've got to look the part. I've got to have all my ducks in a row. I've got to deal with all my sin issues on my own before I actually come to Jesus. But Romans 5, chapter 8, Romans 5, verse 8, is just so profound for me. It says, but God demonstrates his own love for us. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So when you sin, Christ died for you. He died so that sin would no longer have to reign in your life. But he knows it. He knows your sin. So we don't have to hide it. Now, we're not flaunting sin. We're not being disrespectful. But when we can live authentically, when we can live transparently, when we can live in a world where we say we don't have to hide, but we can live in the healing power of Jesus Christ, then that will give us greater spiritual power. That will give us greater spiritual fortitude. That will give us a greater witness. That will build greater community here with us. But I think one of the things we have to do is to recognize we all struggle with sin. And when we walk around with this mentality that I've got it all figured out, that's really difficult for everybody else who doesn't have it all figured out. But I have a few things I want to remind you today that no matter where you are, I think these are important for us to recognize. The first is that Jesus knows what you're going through. He knows your trials. He knows your temptations. He knows your struggles. He knows the ways you fail. He knows the ways you miss the mark. But yet He came for you. No matter your faults, no matter your flaws, Jesus came for you. And He wants you. And He can free you from those things. So maybe you don't have the same problem with donuts like I do. But I'm sure you have a problem that's similar to these donuts. You have a problem of, I know what I want to do, but I don't do it. And I know what I don't want to do, but I still do it. Jesus says, I can free you from that. I can free you from shame. I can free you from guilt. I can free you from pride. I can free you from anything in this world. But we have to come to Him. See, we know these things in our head, but it's about our heart being transformed. We all struggle, but we have a Jesus, a Savior, a Messiah who can deliver us from these things.